Hello, everybody. Week 4. I can't believe it's already here. I have senioritis. I'm so excited for being done with school and a little break, to put it mildly. But for this week, here we are. Discussion board. So, trauma, right? Heavy stuff this week. And I deal with heavy stuff on a regular at work. So, I think that it is a very valid topic, especially going into healthcare. We are often exposed to primary traumas as well as secondary traumas. So the article that I chose to talk about, or case study I chose to talk about, was in chapter 7, and we're going to call it Mr. R's case study based on Jeff's lovely initiation and how to do this whole thing. But basically, it's an overview of a firefighter who has guilt associated with the destruction that took place on 9/11 while he wasn't personally working. And so basically, he kind of goes into a spiral of ruminating and drinking after the stress of the event, feeling as though he's responsible and guilty for not working that day and being part of that sort of active cleanup and fire care. So I think important things to consider during this are that he was dealing with additional stressors. He was going through a divorce and a financial challenge during that time of separation. So I think that would initially put him at a higher risk of sort of other things affecting his coping mechanisms. They say that additional stressors throughout our reading can sort of manifest in pre-triggers. And so I think this is a good example of that, where, he can relate because, his family is falling apart. These families who've, lost loved ones through 9/11 are also experiencing much of the same. So I think that there's a little bit of overlap, and it shows where stress can be easily triggered into sort of that trauma and like push over the edge, which 9/11 is a perfect example of that. So let's see, I'm referring to notes because this is my brain these days, but in the case study, he does get some third-party session support, which is pretty common in public service with firefighting. It's even here in hospital setting. A lot of mental health supports are available. Sometimes they're more within our request versus, I would say, naturally practiced. But I know a couple firefighters who have actively sort of expressed that they have had, support through therapy, psychoeducation, and peer support on a regular as sort of the foundation for structure. And I think that's part of how they're able to do their job well, because they are running into a lot of really stressful situations quite often, right? So one thing I thought that was interesting about this case study is that he could not get his mind off of it, right? So he starts obsessing and kind of going into the cycle of dysfunction, which shows where like your cognition takes over and you don't necessarily think in a practical way due to the emotional response that you're feeling from the experience. And so I think the article goes a little further and talks about, or the case study goes a little further and talks about where, eventually the therapist is like, let's address your cognition before we tend to your emotions. And I think that's a perfect example of sort of like letting him feel what he needs to feel to process, but then really working on what triggers might have sort of gotten him there. Because a lot of times, in especially my job, I go to that very logical place before I try to hit anything emotional as a coping tool. So I think interesting overlaps based on our reading and additional triggers for trauma might be intensified by his profession and just, he is a firefighter, so he, wanted to be there to help those. I found it interesting that he still had a little bit of that PTSD because he did sort of work in the aftermath of sort of the cleanup as part of his job. So it's not like he was completely removed from being part of the 9/11 context, but I guess for the day of and the call of, there was a lot of guilt. And I think guilt is often associated with traumas and high stress situations. So I also think by his friends, his firefighters and his colleagues probably sharing with him their experience, that could intensify, his want or desire to be there and not being able to, or even, potentially those firefighters who lost someone who may not have made it out when trying to rescue other people. Real realities, right? So that is, I guess, my overview. This is not going to be 1, 2, 3 in order, but I think I'm going to cover all of the context. I'm not as eloquent as Jeff ever, but basically choose to describe a response to healing with the trauma on a micro level. And I saw a couple of opportunities here to talk about. I wrote down cognitive schemas, which is that feeling of helplessness that Mr. R, the firefighter, feels with the responsibility he holds himself accountable for and not being there. It's that feeling of helplessness that, although it's beyond like a rational explanation for most of us, he wasn't working, he wasn't scheduled, so there should be no harm or no foul against him. But his cognitive rewiring is telling him that he's ruminating, he feels guilty over it. And so I think this is pointing out where you have to acknowledge those feelings and where they come from. And so that's kind of restructuring that cognitive example, which they use in that third party session, which he agrees to over time. So I think of, support therapy as the healing response for trauma, where Jeff talked about crisis management. I think it falls underneath that category. So I don't know what comes first, but when I think of, supports, it can be peer support, it can be therapeutic interventions when necessary, education, psychoeducation, basically, training, and I guess helping us put into perspective these experiences or stressors that are so extreme and why we might feel that way. One thing I really, really liked was just the article on rethinking trauma, and where I think that ties in is just, people forget that, we have lives outside of our jobs sometimes. And so when we experience things with trauma, or when Mr. R experiences this 9/11 situation, it triggers things for him, but it doesn't get to the root of his precursors, right? He's dealing with his own trauma. He's going through his own divorce. He's having some financial challenges. So I think reframing the structure and expectation is really, really important, and the impact it can have on our interpretation of different experiences. So support through therapy, whether it be peer support, therapeutic support, educational, psychoeducation support. I think these are different ways to, again, help cognitively support us and help us recognize the difference between our logical expectations and, I guess, maybe our more emotional perspectives. And so the last question is, what might the application of this response or case look like? So I reviewed an article, which I'll attach at the bottom of this video, I guess, that talks about just different supports that are available to firefighters specifically, especially in situations of trauma and stress, because it's a field that sees it constantly. And so it's by the American Psychology Association, and really a lot of those supports are built in, which I think this sets a good sort of structure for what I think places who deal with trauma, such as healthcare or these firefighters, police efforts that are more readily exposed to traumas. I think setting up services like a police or a fire station does, where they practice these psychoeducation, and they try to work in discussions and interventions and scenarios of examples, so that when the traumas do arise, they're not foreign to us. So Boy, that's long and that's winded and a little all over the place, but I hope it covers the context. I hope everyone is doing really, really well, and we're so close. We can do it. We can have to go.